if you're welcome.
So you want my argument for the force doctrine?
Yep.
Okay,
let's hear it.
so what force doctrine is saying is very simple. That feminism, if you at least agree with my definition, and it seems broadly feminists do,
Yeah.
that it's a movement towards egalitarianism and equity and the removal of patriarchy. If you can't have an oppressed class without an oppressor class, at least not from the Marxist feminist view. In the case, if women are being oppressed, they're not being oppressed by wolves, they're being oppressed by men, right? So if that's the case, then my argument to them is that whatever you believe this oppression is, you will actually have to appeal to men in order to either relinquish whatever this oppression is, or concede to whatever it is that they want, because collectively women actually cannot overthrow any patriarchal systems. They rely on the force of men. And so if men, anytime they want to, decide to remove women's rights, there's actually not anything women can do about it, but the opposition is not true. The opposite is not true. Women cannot collectivize and take away men's rights.
Okay, so are you essentially saying that women do not deserve the right to fight for their own free will or have free will?
Yeah, that's an ought claim. I'm not making an ought claim. I'm trying to get us to the descriptor first. So instead of making a prescriptive statement, I'm starting with a descriptive statement. What is true? And then we can worry about what should be true after we can determine what is true.
Okay, but I'm trying to see, like, structurally, how does that work in the real world? Are you saying that women should not fight for their rights because they...
Listen, let's back up so I can distinguish two things.
Okay.
Is, ought, right?
Sure.
I'm not trying to bridge the is-ought gap. I'm trying to start with a descriptive claim. So if the descriptive claim is true, then we can move to the prescriptive side of it. But right now, you would either need to agree with me that descriptively I'm right or that descriptively I'm wrong.
I can't agree with you to say that descriptively you're right until you apply what you're saying in theory to the practice of modern day society. How does your equal force objection, how does this principle work in society? What are you saying in terms of how women and men coexist?
Yeah, I think that because that is the case, that men deserve to have various privileges that they're not given in society, which they should be given in society.
So what are the privileges that you think that men should have that women should not have?
Well, primarily, I think that if you're going to look at an equalization, what I would do prescriptively would be to roll voting back. And that's for both sexes. I think that rolling voting back for both sexes is a good idea, and have some sort of perhaps like one house voting system or one marriage voting system, or people who have done some sort of collective service to the state for a voting system. I think that those things would all be very good systems for everybody.
Why?
Now, I would apply that, I would apply that broadly to men, and I would apply that to women. I think that right now men get the shaft because men are required to do a lot of jobs that women are not, which keeps society going, and women are not doing those things. And because of that, I don't understand why it is that women can nullify their votes and disenfranchise them, and most importantly, vote to send them to wars they don't have to go fight in.
So you would like to disenfranchise both the men and women's votes?
Mostly. Most of them, yes. I think would be a better idea.
What would this achieve?
Well, it would achieve the same thing our founders basically wanted to achieve, which is that they thought that you would have to have a stake in the country in order to vote.
But if you live in the country and if you exist in the country and if you're being legislated by the laws that the country is making, don't you have a stake in that?
No, not always.
You don't?
In fact, many times you don't. Many times, many people actually get more back from the state than they put into the state. So that's at the expense of other people.
Who is that?
So there's lots of people who get a mass amount back from the government that they never pay to the government. This can happen through things like Social Security disability, things like welfare, things like even earned income child credit that you may receive even though you don't actually pay anything into the system or very little into the system.
But it's a crime to lie on your taxes and commit. Isn't that tax fraud to claim a dependent?
No. There's just
that is tax fraud.
No. It's not it's not tax fraud. I'm saying that there's
of.
people who get more out of the system than they put into the system.
Okay.
Here I'm gonna have to disagree. I think like a one household vote and all these things. I don't think that's gonna solve any problems we have with the current voting. I think maybe a mental health evaluation would be good, and also like you just gotta remove the bias, which is. And his suggestion is not going to remove any bias. It would actually make it worse. if you want to remove people on welfare and all of these and say they don't have a stake in the country, I mean, most people on welfare are the ones who are reproducing. They're doing all these things. The welfare is just to help ease the problems. Like most of these problems come from poor neighborhoods, you know. There's not a lot of systems in these neighborhoods to support the people. Now you want to tell them they can't vote on matters. Like, so who's going to vote on matters in, like, say, the ghetto? Someone that's not in the ghetto? You know what I'm saying? Like, you still have to hear people's opinion from the actual locations.
But they're still at stake because they still live here, no?
Yeah,
Are their
well,
lives not at stake if we're
what is it?
legislating them?
But that wouldn't follow that because they live here, they deserve the right to vote, though.
Yes, no taxation without representation. That's the point of
Yeah, but
representative
you-
democracy, is
no.
that everyone is represented
Then
in
how come the
democracy.
founding fathers didn't give everybody the right to vote from the beginning?
I mean, the founding fathers also endorsed and owned slaves. Do
Yeah,
you
but
agree
that's-
with chattel
that's-
slavery?
Hold on, just let her finish. Go ahead.
I mean, the
Well, she
founding
just
fathers
asked-
also endorsed
Yeah,
and owned
just-
slaves.
just let her
Okay,
finish.
but
Do you believe in chattel
yeah,
slavery?
So you do realize that they could do bad thing, right? I can agree that's bad thing, but that has nothing relationally to do with how they set up the system of government.
I mean, I thought this was going to be a debate on feminism. Honestly, I think that's kind of wild because it sounds like
Well,
you're
you're-
disenfranchising
well, you're-
men. So who do you think would be? Are you trying
Well, I'm
to
not
go back?
I'm not.
You are. You're
no,
taking
I'm
away.
not disenfranchising men. Calm down. I'll explain
But if
it.
you're taking away the votes of a man
Mm-hmm.
because he is not, I guess, landowning, is that what what's the
Mm-hmm. well, I
criteria
think
for having a vote?
I think ultimately more men would be voting because they would have more stake.
So can I ask? Can every man go to prison?
Yeah.
Okay, if they commit a crime, they can go to prison.
Yeah.
Everyone can do that.
Yes.
Okay. And everyone is in this country has to abide by the laws of this country, otherwise they will go to prison. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so why wouldn't they be allowed to vote on the representatives that define those laws? If that is a stake. If you can go to prison for committing a crime that is created by the government, then you do have a stake legislatively in the laws that the government creates.
That still
No?
wouldn't follow that you would need to vote.
Yes, you would need to vote.
Why?
You want to vote for the representatives that create laws that are just and fair to you.
Yeah. Why? Like you could have
Because
king-
you could go to prison. That's a huge stake.
Let me show. I'll show you. Right? Can kings put you in prison?
Yeah,
Can kings also pass just laws?
sometimes, maybe.
Okay. So
maybe not.
if kings pass just laws, why do you need to vote?
Well, why did we fight
No,
an
no.
entire
Answer the
revolution?
question before you ask another one. I just answered all of yours. If a king passes just laws, why would you need to vote?
Because a king can also pass unjust laws.
So can legislatures.
Sure, but if you have a stake in that and if you're able to represent for your legislator, you can vote a legislator out.
Yeah, but you can
can't
also
vote a king
rebel
out.
against kings. So, like, that's what I'm saying. Your position doesn't follow. It doesn't actually follow for you to say that because you can be imprisoned inside of a nation, that somehow gives you the right to vote.
Well, because
Hang
you
on.
have a stake. You're saying that
hang on. I'm
people
falsifying
don't
your
have a
claim.
stake
I'm
in-
falsifying your claim. If you claim kings can make just laws, right?
Yes.
Then I don't understand. Why would people need to vote when kings are making just laws?
Well, then why?
Oh, I think once again, like Andrew, he's wrong on this one. We don't really live in a country with a king. I know we're still using the Roman system, but in a democracy, there does need to be a vote. And if you eliminate all low income neighborhoods from the vote, that's creating a bias. Like there's already a overwhelming bias in this country. If you can go to jail, you should be able to vote on the people throwing you in jail for the crimes that they're throwing you in jail for. Just like felons should be able to vote. If felons can't vote and have the same rights as other citizens, they shouldn't be paying as much taxes as other citizens. It doesn't make any sense that you're paying the same amount of money to have less rights.
Why would we leave the monarchy of England? If kings can make just laws, why would we leave?
Well, in that case, you had a nation apart that had a rebellion against the king.
Yes,
That's what was
sure.
going on. But kings have been rebelled against historically under certain circumstances many times.
So you'd like to go back to feudalism? Like
No,
you
it's not
don't believe in
feudalism.
democracy? Well, yeah, that is
No,
the
it would be
feudalism.
a
Feudalism is under a monarchy.
It would be called limited democracy, which is exactly what we had here. Do you think we had feudalism because most people couldn't vote here?
We had limited democracy, and then there were like many uprisings against that limited democracy because everyone
No,
deserves
there
the
wasn't
right.
uprisings really against that. The only uprising that I'm aware of in American history against America was the Civil War.
The Civil War, the Civil Rights
But that wasn't
movement,
about
the first
voting.
feminist movement,
That
the
wasn't
second
about
feminist
voting.
movement, the Civil Rights movement,
No,
the
no,
voting rights movement.
no. The
All of
Civil
those were
War
about-
wasn't about voting.
Well, I mean, it was about.
There was Shays' Rebellion, where farmers protested hardships and tax collection. There was Doors' Rebellion, an attempt to force a new government in Rhode Island to get more men to vote. There was Anti-Rent War, where rent was too high and affected living conditions, so they revolted. The New York Civil Draft Riot, which was the largest insurrection in American history. And last but not least, the election riot of 1874, where white supremacists took Republicans out of the office and declared Democrats the winners. I mean, all in all, we have many uprisings, and most of them are over the right to vote and taxes, like this woman said.
The owning of chattel slaves.
So not about voting then?
Which is also about human and civil rights.
But not about voting, though.
But voting is a civil right.
I don't know. I'm not sure that I believe in
It's
this
about freedom and it's about
conceptual-
representation.
Yeah. So
the
let's
point is
So
representation.
let's back up.
That's what voting is.
Yeah.
Voting is representation and democracy.
I understand, but you haven't actually made the positive case for why people need to be able to vote.
People need to be able to vote because they have a stake in the legislation in this country. If you can be imprisoned in this country, if you can be robbed of your bodily autonomy by the legislators of this country, then you should be able to have a stake in what the laws that those legislators are making.
Well,
no?
let's see if this makes sense. Do you agree with me that individual voters don't actually have very much power at all?
Individual voters, no, but that's the point of a collective voting body.
I'm with you. So
Yeah.
individuals already don't really have very much power just because they can vote, right?
Sure.
So isn't it the case, actually, that what you're advocating for is political tribalism? Because you don't have individual power as a voter, you actually have to tribalize with other voters in order to have any sort of collective power, right?
Well, why would a person in Georgia get to vote on a
So
legislator
it's not
for a
really the
California state
collective, it's
legislator?
the tribe, right?
But then Georgians get to vote for their
Right,
state
so it's a
legislator.
tribe then?
And then all of those legislators come together
So it's a
to
tribe.
create laws.
So it's a tribe?
It's not a tribe, but those are called states.
Yeah,
That's what
states are voting for their own interests, right?
But states will vote for the governors.
Yeah.
Why would I get to vote for the governor? Hold on, pause.
Hold on. Let her
Listen to
finish.
me. Why would I get to vote for the governor of, let's say, Tennessee, if I
Right.
don't live in Tennessee?
Makes sense.
No, Andrew's definitely got you here. I mean, states are kind of like tribes, like the Indian tribes. You had different states, they voted on their stuff, they kept it separate. The federal government's the only thing that really separates from tribes.
Okay.
So it's almost
So
like
then
these
why would-
individual states, right? They vote along tribal lines for that state's particular interests, right?
Yes, and
They're
then
not,
each state has a representative
right,
in
which
the
they said
collective government.
Sure, in the federal government, right? You're talking about in our Senate and in our Congress, right?
Yes.
Great. So let's start with this. If it is the case that you have California and Nevada, these are two states which are next to each other, you agree,
Sure.
right?
Yes.
Can these states vote against each other's interests when it comes
course
to
they can.
resources?
In the federal government, yes. they
No,
can.
even at the state level they can, right?
Why would they be able to at the state level? I can't vote for the Nevada governor. I can't vote for
Because perhaps there's something
Nevada
that perhaps
legislators.
Nevada has some type of, I don't know, assessed a tax or something like this that they're able to collect, which disproportionately affects Californians in some way. As I'm giving you descriptors so we can determine if it's tribalism or not, because you said it's not tribalism to have collectivism in voting blocks, which is insane.
But what you haven't been able to answer is why disenfranchising more voters is somehow
Well, let me-
solving
Hold on,
political
Hold on, just
tribalism.
let her get to the end
All
of the
right.
sentence, please.
Well,
Go
let me
ahead.
explain it
Sure.
the best way that I possibly can.
I hope
Your
you try.
worldview promotes political tribalism. So what happens is this: NGOs can go to our government and they can bribe them for voting blocks, and that's exactly what they do. Non-government organizations do this, and lobbyists do this. And what they do is they raid the treasury from people like you and me so that they can bribe certain portions of the electorate in order to incentivize them to collectivize.
Okay.
That's why black people often vote as a monolith, for instance. They vote monolithically, up to 80, 90% together, especially in national elections, because they're made certain promises out of the treasury from the electorate, usually at the expense of other forms of voters. This is 100% tribalism.
Now, I would agree with Andrew here, but I think what you have is more of the Democratic Party at fault. As I said earlier, the Democratic Party is usually trying to cater to black people while still really not really offering them anything. If you blame the victims of this, you really solve nothing. You have to blame the Democratic Party instead of like blaming like the ignorant black voters, you know.
So how are NGOs bribing politicians, influencing who black people as individuals choose to vote for?
How do NGOs do that?
I just don't understand how you're saying. I mean, I agree that NGOs should not be bribing and lobbyists shouldn't be bribing, but instead of
that's
saying,
what they do though, right?
Okay, but we're trying to get back to your claim that
I'm in
less
the middle of
people
my
should
claim.
vote. Okay, well, I'm responding because this is a conversation.
Yeah.
Sure. So we're trying to get back to your claim that less people from both sexes should be able to vote.
Yeah, no, that's not where we just were.
But that's your initial claim,
Yeah, but
yes?
now you're just pivoting. Where we just were was...
Well, you're not letting me finish my sentence.
No,
if you'd let
because
me finish my sentence,
you're
we could go back.
pivoting. We're talking right now about whether tribalism is descriptively true in your voting system.
I understand that, but we're trying to get back to your initial claim because you have a very important claim to defend. You're trying to take votes away from the American people poorly, but let's get into it. So NGOs bribe, lobbyists bribe, and that is impacting who and what politicians are promoting. I would agree with that statement. Would you agree with that statement?
Well, not just what they're promoting, but also they are setting the precedent for laws themselves.
Okay, yes.
So they actually, I would even argue back that NGOs and private think groups write the laws in which politicians most often execute, and so do bankers as well.
I agree with that. So why would taking away votes from the average American and singular citizen prevent NGOs and lobbyists from having an ability to impact and predict and create laws?
Yeah, so if you move to stakeholder democracy, this idea that you had to have some sort of public service or something like this, it actually collectivizes down the voting pool, which adds responsibility to the voters who can then be held accountable, which right now voters can't be. That's why it's so important. So
Voters can be held accountable.
So you're saying how?
Well, legislators will create laws that hold those voters accountable.
How?
We're the ones who have to follow them. Do you not have to follow the laws?
Well, that's not you being held accountable.
It is being held accountable.
No. So right now, under tribalism, you can get laws passed which affect me but benefit you. I can't go hold you somehow accountable for that.
But that's how a majority voting works. That's how democracy
I know,
works.
which is why I want limited democracy where we can actually hold people
because
accountable.
You just want to be in charge.
How would I be in charge if it's stakeholder democracy?
Well, you said one marriage voting system.
That could be one way of doing it, yes.
Okay, what are the other ways of doing that?
Another good way would be public service.
So whoever does a public service.
Perhaps up to 3 to 5 years unpaid, or military service would be good.
So during this public service in which people are working 3 to 5 years unpaid, how are they paying for food and groceries and housing?
Yeah, so the state would take care of that just like they do in the military.
The state would take care of that like they do in the military. And how do you plan on getting that passed?
What does that have to do with anything?
Well, because
let's say I could never get it passed. We're arguing the ideology of this system. What does that have to do with anything?
Now, I think that Andrew may mean well here, but I think all of his points are just going to fall victim to the corruption of the system. I don't think military service or any of these things are going to bypass the will of these big companies, these big banks, like you were just talking about. They're going to incentivize what they want. It doesn't matter what the hell you're doing, you know? The more votes you take away, the more power they're going to have. It's not, You think it's going to give power back to the people? You think they're just going to let you vote for what you want? It's not going to happen like that. They're going to vote on what they want. The only way to change that is to fix the system, to change the system, to remove these big biases, these big companies out of the vote. If you give them more power in the vote, you're just going to have more problems. That's it.
What's the point in creating an ideology that will never work in
How are you going to
practice?
get Marxism passed?
You're not.
So
That's why it's
aren't
a
you a
bad
Marxist? But you're a Marxist, right?
How did you know that?
Well, I don't
Who
know.
told you
That's what
that?
your videos seem to imply, that you believe in Marxist
Did I ever
feminism.
say that I was in Marxist?
Oh, I don't know. Are you a socialist?
On a certain level.
Okay,
somewhat.
how are you going to get socialist? Like, that's silly. That us making the comparison contrast between like socialism, capitalism has no bearing on whether or not I could somehow get this passed or have some plan to get it passed.
Okay.
I'm arguing about the ideology here.
Do you want to understand my belief, or do you just want to guess?
Well, hang on. What does that have to? Do you know what I just said, though?
Well, I mean, you just called me a Marxist.
Do you
just called me
agree?
a socialist,
Well,
but
if
you
you're not a
don't even know what
Marxist, I
believe.
retract that. You said you're somewhat a
Thank you.
socialist. That's fair, but do you realize that we're doing a comparison contrast of worldviews and ideology? If we're doing contrast worldview and ideology, it's a non sequitur to ask me, well, how are you going to get it passed? What does that have to do with anything?
Well, why would you create a worldview that fundamentally cannot work in practice? That
Well,
sounds
it's
like
not
a
a
waste of time.
worldview that fundamentally cannot work in practice.
But you couldn't say how it works in practice.
Even if I couldn't prescriptively tell you, like the next political chain of things we do to get there has nothing to do with whether or not the worldview in practice would work.
Well, do you have any practical guesses for how we could apply this to a modern day society?
Well, I just just told you how we would apply it. You would have stakeholder democracy.
Okay, so that's just so one day we're just going to flip a switch and have that. Like, I don't understand.
No, what do you mean? Okay, you could have an amendment for it. You could repeal the 19th Amendment. You could...
So you want to repeal the right to vote?
Or just replace it. It wouldn't
With-
be... What I'm talking about is universal suffrage. You keep on making a conflation in terms. You think that because I say universal suffrage, that means no suffrage. I'm talking about limited suffrage.
So who gets to decide who gets the right to vote?
Didn't I literally just tell you who gets to decide who gets to vote?
Okay, so everyone who participates in this public service gets the right to vote.
That could be one way to do it, yes.
Okay, and that anyone could do that. Who wanted to?
Yeah, people could do it if they're willing to give up X amount of years of their lives for unpaid service so that they could then vote.
But it's not unpaid service because the government would be paying for their food and their housing. and
Yeah,
their-
but you wouldn't be getting anything additional to that.
Okay, well, why not just have civil servants who are already...
Because civil servants have specific jobs to do, like, working at the DMV and stuff like that, and working in the Social Security office.
So you're basically saying anyone who does community service should get the right to vote?
No, some sort of civil occupational service under the state. That could be like civil firefighting work, maybe. It could be civil paramedic work. It could be there's all sorts of different things you can look at for stakeholder democracy. When we've seen it applied around the world, it's been somewhat successful.
And do the laws apply to everyone in the society or just the people who
Yeah,
choose
they
to
still
participate
apply
in this
to everyone,
democracy?
yeah.
I still don't see how in any way that this would help. I mean, you could have stakeholder democracy if you want to. It's still going to be rigged. It's still going to be biased. Without mental health evaluation, anybody, including pedos or anything, are we having pedos vote for laws? I mean, what is going to disqualify the wrong people from voting? That's going to make this system any better than the one we have now.
Okay, so how can you create and apply a law to people who are not represented? I just don't understand. Morally, how do you justify?
There's nothing immoral about it.
There's nothing immoral about. I mean, but that's
Like,
kind of
I would say it's
consent.
more immoral. Why is it moral for an 18-year-old to nullify the vote of a 41-year-old if the 18-year-old doesn't even know what they're voting for? How's that moral?
Well, because the 18-year-old is still subject to the laws of the state.
Yeah, but they don't
If an
even know
18-year-old
what they're voting for.
Can an 18-year-old go to jail for 20 years?
A 16-year-old can. Should they be able to vote?
16-year-olds can't go to jail.
Yes, they can. 16-year-olds can go to jail for life. Should they be able to vote?
I mean, no, but why?
Well, why
would they be
not?
going
Why
to
not?
jail
The
for-
laws apply to them, though.
Why would a 16-year-old be going?
Hang
to
on,
jail
I don't
for
understand.
that,
Because he murdered someone.
though? Okay, that's fair. I mean, if you
Yeah.
murder someone, that's a whole.
So I don't understand. Why can't he vote? The laws
because we
apply to
all
him. Why can't he
understand
vote?
that. Yeah, but we all understand that. a
No,
16-year-old
we all understand it's not an argument. Why does a 16-year-old get to vote, even though all the laws apply to the 16-year-old? Why does he get to vote?
No, the laws apply. They start in juvenile detention, and then at 18, they get the right to go.
So laws apply
They
to
they're
16-year-olds?
But you're retried at 18.
So
like when you
laws
start at
apply to
16,
16-year-olds?
Some laws, of course.
Okay,
yes.
great. Why can't they vote then?
So babies should get the right to vote?
That's my
you're a
question
minor.
to you. That makes no sense. Exactly. So why do we limit it to 18?
Well, that's the age that we've defined as being a legal adult. That's the age that we as a country have universally agreed with our right to vote is.
Yeah, but what
the
makes
age of
that a
legal
good
adult.
idea? Just
That's
because
the
you
age of
arbitrarily.
consent. That's the age
Yeah,
of-
but just because you arbitrarily say, for instance, that because you're 18 and you're an adult, like you can't buy cigarettes, you can't buy beer, you can't rent a car, but you're an adult. And now you can vote in the
So would you like to
participation of
lower the
democracy.
age of
At
an
least
adult?
raise it.
So you'd like to raise it?
At least raise it.
So you would like to universally raise the age to vote? I think that
At
would be a better
least.
idea than like not allowing
No.
anyone.
What I said is at least do that. But the thing is, like, you're actually inconsistent here. Your whole argument is to say if laws affect people, they should have a right to vote. But we have an entire cast of people from the age 17 down who laws apply to and can't vote. And you just are like, you shrug that off like you didn't contradict yourself.
I'm pretty sure it has something to do with brain development. But we've all, like, you have to have an
Not fully
age at
developed
which-
till what, 25 according
But how
to
do you have a
the
society
studies?
in which you don't have an age that someone becomes a legal
I
adult?
agree, but why couldn't you have a society in which you had stakeholder democracy?
Oh, I mean, he's kind of losing it at this one because like she's coming from a more centered point. I mean, I think they would both agree on raising the voting age, and she's right that people voted on 18 being the age to vote. I still don't know where that comes with stakeholder democracy. Like that's like way off topic, and he's not presenting any way that this would help the country.
It would
Because
be, it's the
nobody's-
same logic.
So if you're saying that we should not disenfranchise children, why would you then disenfranchise people who are legal adults?
When did I ever make the claim that I wanted children to be able to vote?
You just said that if everyone should have the
No,
right
I
to vote.
told you that your view is inconsistent. If it is the case propositionally, you say, Andrew, if laws apply to people, they should be able to vote. Except, I don't know, everybody 17 and under. That's inconsistent.
Because the
hang
laws
on, hang
do
on.
apply to children
It's
differently than they apply
inconsistent
to
and a
adults.
contradiction.
But laws do apply to
What about the
children
laws that
differently
don't?
than they do.
What about the laws that don't? What about the laws where you're 17 years old and you can be tried as an adult?
Well, those are to protect like public freedom. I mean,
Right.
but everyone loses civil liberties when they are a danger to the public.
Yeah, but do you
That's
really,
everyone.
Do you understand that you're making a contradiction when you say if laws should apply to all people should have a right to vote because they have laws which can be applied, they can be sent to prison was your example. That would have to include everyone under the age of 18.
But people under the age of 18 don't go to adult
Yes,
prisons.
they do all
No,
the
they
time.
don't.
Yes, they do.
What's your source?
That is you want me to give you sources of 16, 17-year-olds tried as adults and sent to adult prisons?
Okay, but that's like an exception for exclusively horrific crimes. I mean, those
But
are violent offenders.
does the law apply to them or not?
To violent offenders, if you are a threat to public safety, yes. Everyone who
then
is a
if
threat
the
to public
law
safety,
applies to them and they can be sent to jail, then by your logic, they should be able to vote, which
But for
means
those
you're in
offenders, they are-
contradiction.
To those offenders, they are sent to juvenile detention centers until they turn 18, and then they are sent to an adult prison. They are
No,
still
they're
tried as a
sent
child.
often to adult centers, even at 17, to adult prisons.
You can be sentenced as an adult, but you can't be sent to an adult prison at the age of 16.
This would depend widely on the state that you're in. It's not rigorously enforced across the board like you think. There's not like, I don't think there's federal laws which say this. But
Well, then I
even if
think
it
that's
were the case,
wrong.
I'll just grant it.
Well, then that's wrong.
I'll even grant the entire thing. It still wouldn't matter. Laws apply to them. They can still be sent to prison. They fit both of your criteria. Therefore, if you say they shouldn't be able to vote, your worldview's in contradiction.
Well, then
Andrew's just being bad faith here. I mean, he just doesn't want to see her side of the argument. I do admit that she is very lacking in her knowledge of children being tried, but like she said, that is an exception, and he's just being bad faith and not like acknowledging the facts that she's spitting.
I think that's wrong. I don't believe that children should be tried as adults until they have become adults.
So no
I
laws
disagree with
apply to
that.
children.
No.
Well, then why shouldn't they be able to vote?
A threat to public safety always applies to everyone. Threats to public safety always apply to everyone.
Yeah, but why shouldn't they be able to vote if laws apply to them? That's your example.
Laws apply to children, but they are not, in practice, punished in the same way that they apply to adults. It's applied
Can they be
differently.
punished?
Of course they can
Then
be
why
punished.
can't they vote?
But you have to have some way to maintain societal control. Children aren't just allowed to do whatever the fuck they want because they're
Right.
kids.
You need to be able to have some sort of societal control. So
Yes.
this would mean necessarily disenfranchising some people, wouldn't it?
It would mean necessarily disenfranchising children. Yes, they're not adults.
No, it would also mean disenfranchising prisoners. Do you want prisoners to vote on their right to own guns in a prison?
Not their right to own guns in a prison.
Well, then you're
But I
disenfranchising
do think
them.
that people who were in prison and then leave prison should then have
Felons?
the right to vote.
But they're disenfranchised currently under the law, right?
No, they're not.
Yes, they are. If you're a felon, you can't vote.
Yes. Oh, well, once they leave, yes, I do think that that's disenfranchisement, and I think Florida just rolled that back.
Yeah,
for
but
Florida.
what's wrong with disenfranchising like murderers for life?
What's wrong with disenfranchisement? Well, they would be in jail for life. If
No.
they committed a
They're
murder.
out of jail. They're just felons, so they can't vote.
Well, I think that felons should be able to vote once they
Should
have
felons be able to own guns?
No, because
Oh, well, I don't understand you. So you're
Now, you're both wrong here. I just want to say this is the big distinction in voting. You have people, see, both of them cannot agree on much of anything, but one thing they do agree on is felons shouldn't bear arms. Now, that would be good and dandy, but there's been many laws, mostly the 1994 Mass Incarceration Act, which Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have both went back against because it was very unfair and it made many more crimes felonies that weren't felonies. Many nonviolent offenders are being charged with felonies. It's ridiculous. You get out of jail, you have to get in no trouble for 7 years, 7 to 8 years to get this removed, to even try to get your gun rights back. And what danger are you really to society if you've committed a nonviolent crime just because you have the term felony? It's ridiculous, and this is why, I listen to this debate, I'm trying not to be biased, but certain things people say, you could really tell, they have no idea what they're talking about. And these two have no idea what they're talking about on this subject.
This again,
But do
you
you
are
understand-
so inconsistent with your
Pause, Meta.
disenfranchising.
Pookie, do you understand?
What?
Disenfranchisement should exist so long as someone is a threat to public safety. The reason why prisoners are not allowed to vote who are currently in prison is because they are a threat to public safety.
16-year-olds aren't a threat to public safety.
No, but they're children. You can't allow anyone to
So
vote
you
who's a
can
child.
arbitrarily disenfranchise people based on the fact that you think they're not capable of making good voting decisions, right?
No, a child is legally different than an adult.
Because they can't make
You can't have
good-
sex with a child.
because
That
they
would be
can't
statutory rape.
because they can't make good decisions.
No, because they're legally classified as a child. Do you not understand what
Because
a
they
child is?
can't make good decisions.
Because they're 2 and 3 and 4. They're not legally an
So
adult.
they can't make good decisions.
No, they can make good decisions, but generally speaking, you can't have children vote. There is a
I
legal age
agree
to
with
vote.
you. You can't.
Okay.
But why is it then that if I were to say that I only want 25-year-olds to vote, I would be disenfranchising?
But you didn't say you only want 25-year-olds to vote. You
do you
said
understand?
that you only want one marriage voting system per household.
Yeah,
You
well, that's
said
one way, yeah.
You want less of
But-
both adult men and
But do you
adult
understand how
women
my
to
view
be
is
able to vote.
consistent, but yours isn't? Because if you were to agree with me that you wanted, okay, Andrew, I would compromise the 25-year-olds voting. You've now disenfranchised everyone from the ages of 18 through 24.
If you were considered
all
a legal
overnight.
adult, you should be able to vote. That's my state. If you are considered a legal adult, if you are tried as an adult, if you are allowed to buy a house,
Yeah.
have a child.
But that leads to the problem is that leads to political tribalism. So, for instance, why is it a healthy society to have men and women who are married voting against each other? That's a terrible idea.
Because they're both but if a man commits a murder, does his wife go to jail for that crime?
No.
No, because they're not the same fucking person.
What does that have to do with anything?
If they're different people and they're both tried differently and they both have separate lives
Yeah.
and separate bank accounts
Yeah.
and separate bodily and physical autonomy,
Yeah.
then they should each get a stake in this government. No.
Well, that literally has nothing to do with what I just asked.
They're not the same
So real
person,
quick,
so
can
why
you-
should they be represented
You remember
as the
how
same
I said
thing?
yes and no to your question? Can you do that for me? Remember how I was like yes and just answered it? Can you actually do that for
I
me
don't
too?
remember that at all.
You literally just asked me that question. You said if a husband's carted off to prison, does her wife go to prison? I said no.
Okay.
Can you do that for me too, and then give your explanation? Because otherwise, I don't
That's
know
what I
your
just did.
actual
I said
position.
His thing and then gave the explanation.
So now I'd like to know,
You should listen
do you
to-
think it's a good idea for wives and husbands to be able to vote against each other's interests?
They should both have a vote, yes.
Well, but they can vote against each other's interests, right?
That is circumstantial. They may not, they might.
Yeah, they may not, they might. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But why is it good that option's even there. It seems like a terrible idea.
Because in a representative democracy, everyone should be represented with a vote.
Yeah, I get that's a descriptive truth, but you're not telling me why that should be the case. If I were to give you the counterclaim here, I would say if you had like one household voting or something like this, it would be much more uniform and wouldn't divide families against each other. And that's exactly what the vote has done.
But they're both subject to the same legislative, like they can both be legislated independent of each other, right?
No, well, not really. One cannot, at that point, make a decision that doesn't affect the other one, usually.
Yes, I can.
Not really. What?
I mean, Roe v. Wade. That only affects a woman's body, right? No?
You think that if a man is married to a woman and she goes and aborts his baby, that doesn't affect him?
Of course it does, but it affects him differently than his body.
But it's still, but that's my whole point is that everything they do in this household is going to affect each other.
Now, she was making a lot of ground, but at the end of the day, she's still a feminist, so it still comes back to Roe v. Wade. I think there could still be the same problem if there is just one household voting, but I could see the benefits too. But definitely Roe v. Wade definitely affects both parties, because if the man wants the baby and the woman doesn't and she aborts it, that could cause them lifelong damage. I mean, just because she's the only one that's actually having the pregnancy doesn't mean she's the only one affected by it. Most definitely. But, feminists bringing up Roe v. Wade is normal.
Sure.
So you wouldn't want to promote systems
But they
which
still are
divide
individuals.
husbands against wives.
But they're individuals, no.
What does
Are
that
they
do
the
with
same
anything?
Are they the same person or not?
This is not what's in dispute.
Are they the same person or not?
Okay, no.
Then why should they not each have an individual liberty? What if they get a
Because
divorce?
you don't want to set up systems that divide them against each other. That's
well,
a bad
then don't
idea.
marry someone who doesn't want to vote for you, with you. But that's...
No, do you understand that like people's preferences change over time, and there could be various reasons in which, if you have a tribal type of mentality, like take abortion for instance. Abortion's a great one. Do you think that it's possible that women, for instance, could hold it against their husband and say things like, "Do this or I'll abort your child"? They could actually do that, right?
Yeah, hypothetically, sure.
Yeah, and have
that
done
would be
that.
immoral.
And have done that.
That would be immoral
Yeah,
and wrong.
but you wouldn't say they couldn't go get the abortion, would you?
But would you say a man can...
But hang on. Answer the question first.
What?
You wouldn't say that they shouldn't be allowed to do that, though, would you?
Well, if it would be disenfranchising millions of other women who aren't in that situation
That's
and need an abortion, then
yes or no, please. You wouldn't say that you would not actually say that they should not be allowed to get the abortion, right?
no, I think everyone should have access to
Okay,
free
so
will.
even if it were the case that a woman, right, was holding the man basically emotionally hostage with her pregnancy and said, "Do what I say or I'll get an abortion," right? You would not make any claim that she could or could not get that abortion, would you?
I would make a claim that what she's doing is immoral, but I wouldn't make a claim that
And
because
should
one
anything
person is
happen to a
immoral-
woman who does that?
Yeah,
What?
I mean that's blackmailing. I think
It's
that's a
not
crime.
blackmail.
I think on a level it's emotional blackmail. I
Yeah.
think you should be able
So
to sue someone
what
for
should happen?
emotional
Should they
blackmail.
go to jail?
I mean, maybe pay damages or a fine.
A fine?
Yeah.
How much should the fine be?
I don't know.
$200?
How
Dude.
much is an abortion?
They'd be the same as an abortion.
Can I ask you a question?
So just
Can
to
I
get
ask
this
you a
right, well, I
question?
want to finish this real quick.
No, can
and
I
then we
ask
can
you a
move
question?
back. Well, no, you can't until I finish the inquiry.
Okay,
but
well,
then
I'm not going to answer your question.
But then,
until I
but you
ask
can
mine.
inquire back. I
She's totally being biased here.
just want to finish this inquiry,
Go
the
for
line
it.
of inquiry. That's all. So just to make sure I got this right, you have now said that the tribal voting does indeed pit husband against wife, has a potential to do so, right? And I've even conceded to specific examples of where it would be in a woman's interest to vote against her husband, to have a right to do something which could be used against him later, and then said, well, the punishment should be like, oh, maybe she pays a fine if something like that happens. And how are you going to convince people that that's a better system than one household voting? That's a terrible system.
Because then the leader of that household or the head of that household has control over the right and the will of every single person in that household. You're fundamentally denying people free will. They're
I'm
not
not-
allowed to. Yes, they are. Because if they're
Fundamental
both
denying of
legislated-
free will, huh?
Because if they're both legislated by the same government, and one of them has no say in who is elected into that government,
So?
but still, because you're still
They still have
impacted
free
by
will.
law, but you're still impacted by laws.
So what? You're being impacted by laws when you're 17. They can't vote. You have a consistency
Not at the
issue.
same extent as an 18-year-old. Not at the same
They
extent. as an
can
adult.
have it to the same extent as an 18-year-old.
In very rare exceptions, but you're
Yeah, but they
fighting on
can
an-
then,
but
so you're
fighting on an
disenfranchising
exception.
people.
But look at
Yeah, I'm gonna split this up into multiple videos, but basically what I took from this first part was, I mean, they both have good views on it. It's just neither one really has a proper solution to the problem. Um, I mean, she's a feminist, he's religious, but the problem of voting is deeply rooted, and I think it needs to be better researched to find an actual solution. If you like these videos, please like and subscribe. I'm trying to get this channel going. Thank you.